True power has arrived. Hello, everybody. It's me, Sci-Fi. I am back again with another weapon review today. And today I decided to take another look at the infested weapons, and I wanted to talk about one that I have grown a very, very deep love for in the past couple of weeks, and that is the Mutalist Cernos. So the Mutalist Cernos is an infested variant of the normal Cernos that can be acquired on the market by either purchasing it outright for platinum or by collecting its blueprint from the market for credits and using a normal Cernos as well as multiple infested materials to build it. It can be built at Mastery Rank 7 and is considered by many people not that valuable because they want to use it to build the Proboscis Cernos, which is the Mutalist Cernos' bigger brother. However, despite that, I'm reviewing it today. And you know that if I'm reviewing something, it's gotta be good. So let's get into it. So the Mutalist Cernos is primarily an impact-weighted weapon, with a very high impact rating. However, unfortunately, the bow, in comparison to most other bows as well, has a pretty low crit chance of 15%, as well as a pretty average crit multiplier of 2x, which doesn't make it the best if you want to invest entirely in the crit, but the status chance on this thing is where things get ridiculous, for it has a status chance of 49%, which means that it is basically meant to be a status monster in comparison to other weapons, making it really good if you want to go for status effect damage like toxin or heat or electric. Basically, you want to invest in the dots on this thing. And this idea of it being a status monster is reinforced even further by the fact that it has a pretty decent fire rate as well in comparison to other weapons, and getting to the charge shot is no hassle at all. But you'll see later on in the video why it might not be the best to do the charge shot. I'm not going to spoil it yet, but just know that quick shots is probably going to be the way to go, despite it having a really good fire rate and charge rate. Now, all the stats I've mentioned up until now mostly apply to the base of the weapon, that being the arrows themselves. The AoE cloud system of this weapon is a different story. You see, the AoE clouds of this weapon scale off of the toxin damage that you see on the stat screen. Yeah, that little itty bitty bit of toxin you see, that's the cloud damage, which honestly looks pretty pitiful until you realize a few things. One, the clouds can crit and apply status effects of their own with the right mods. So, for example, in the stat screen, as you can see, there's this thing where, like, if you apply one mod to the stats and you'll get both stats, that's the cloud damage and the arrow damage separately. Meaning that you could have two different damage types built into the bow, which is really funny and really cool because it technically means if you use something like, say, corrosive and or electric or something else on the weapon, you can have the clouds doing the aura strip for you while you deal damage with the bow itself. And to top this all off, the Mutalist Cernos' clouds also force proc Toxin on their attacks, meaning that if you wanted to invest in, say, a straight-up Toxin build, you can not only get the force proc Toxin, but also more Toxin procs with its attacks, making it extremely good against enemies like the Corpus, for example, or just unarmored units. Now, there is a lot more to this weapon that I wish I could discuss, but the problem is, I'm not the smartest guy for this kind of stuff. So, for the purposes of this video, I decided to consult a very good friend of mine named Nev. He is another creator. He is very, very smart, very, very intelligent when it comes to warframe maths. And specifically when it comes to Mutalist Cernos, he's been telling me some things and explaining some things to me about that even I wasn't aware of and didn't think were possible. And for this reason, I decided to consult him and let him have his own dedicated section in this video where he's going to be talking about the Mutalist Cernos. Now, a little bit of a warning, he is going to go over, at least in the first 2 to 3 minutes, stuff that I've already mentioned here, but it's important to know this kind of stuff for when he talks about the other intricacies that he's going to bring up in this segment. So with that, I'm going to let my buddy Nev take it over from here for a little bit, and then after that, we're going to continue on with the Mutalist Cernos review. See you guys in a few minutes.
Hello everybody, my name is Nev, and we're going to be discussing the Mutalist Cernos today. You might already know some of the strange behaviors of the Mutalist Cernos, such as the fact that sometimes statuses separate, but I bet you didn't know that the clouds themselves behave differently based on whether or not the shot is charged. We'll discuss all that in full detail, but for now, let's start with the basics. The arrows that are fired from the Mutalist Cernos have AoE clouds attached to them. When the arrows attach themselves to a target or the environment, the AoE cloud will linger and tick for 5 damage every 1 second, with a forced toxin proc per damage tick. This toxin proc is consistent regardless of whether or not you have fused with your toxin element, and both the cloud and toxin proc scale as expected with Serration, toxin, and faction mods, meaning all bonuses are multiplicative with each other, and faction damage double dips as expected on the DOT. The clouds themselves can also get critical hits, enhancing damage drastically. If you combine an element with toxin modded on the weapon, such as using cold and toxin to create viral, the direct hit from both the arrow and the cloud will proc viral. The cloud will also proc toxin every tick regardless of status chance. Uncharged arrow clouds will use the base status chance of your weapon, regardless of mods, but a fully charged shot will use your modded status chance, meaning if you want your clouds to apply lots of procs, you'll want to full charge. Keep in mind that a forced toxin proc is always separate from your status chance in this example, so your clouds will proc viral based on your status chance and always proc toxin, with a toxin proc never taking away from your opportunity to proc viral. Building without using toxin mods deviates quite drastically from what we would expect to see from the weapon, however, as solo elements will have both their toxin infused and unfused versions present on the weapon. Modding for strictly cold, in this example, will give us viral and cold in the mod screen, and we will still be getting our forced toxin procs from the clouds. The clouds from both the charged and uncharged shots will not proc our unfused cold element, but will proc fused viral. That is to say that only the direct hits from the arrow itself will proc the cold status effect, and the clouds will proc viral as well as their forced toxin proc. The arrow's direct hits will only proc the unfused cold element and will not proc viral or toxin. Because the clouds are the things doing the fused procs, this means that you cannot use the AoE clouds to get solo status effects on enemies, unless that solo status effect is toxin. You will only be able to get cold procs, heat procs, and electric procs on the target that you have hit directly with the arrow. Let's quickly discuss Galvanized Aptitude, or Gun CO, and its behavior with the bow, as the Mutalist Cernos' unique firing mechanics behave incredibly strangely, and in some cases multiplicatively. I'll be using a hit scan secondary weapon modded with negative damage to prime enemies and leave their HP intact as much as possible, a strategy that you can use on Demolishers and Archons to not trigger their damage attenuation while priming. All 4 attacks from the Mutalist Cernos, those being the Uncharged Shot, the Uncharged Cloud, the Charged Shot, and the Charged Cloud, all behave differently with Gun CO. The Uncharged Shot and the Uncharged Cloud both have multiplicative Gun CO, meaning that the Galvanized Aptitude mod is its own unique multiplier and is not additive to Serration like most weapons. It is entirely separate from faction, crit, damage vulnerability, etc. The Charge Shot of the Mutalist Cernos actually has diminished CO, and is additive with Serration bonus. It is diminished by a factor of 50%, meaning that the damage bonus for a Charge Shot is only giving 50% of what is expected. This diminished value is due to the fact that the Charge Arrow bonus is scaling off of the uncharged arrow value. Finally, the Charge Cloud from the Mutalist Cernos has a CO factor of a whopping 4100% additive to Serration mods. It is also based on the uncharged arrow value and not its own base damage of 5. Something important to know about the fused elemental bonuses is that not all elemental fusions are created equally. There's a difference in-game between getting a viral bonus from a toxin and cold fusion, and getting a viral bonus all by itself. Using either Lavos or Saren can help showcase what I mean. Saren has the ability to infuse pure corrosive damage on weapon attacks, and with the help of Nourish, we can even infuse both viral and corrosive. On the Mutalist Cernos, we can mod our weapon to have gas on it by infusing solo heat in the mod screen. Both the viral and corrosive damage that we have added to the weapon when we use our abilities is entirely separate from toxin, and therefore is present on both the arrows themselves and in the clouds, while the heat damage remains tied to the direct hit arrows and the gas damage remains on the clouds exclusively. This behavior is maybe what you expected. If we were to use a radiation mod or Oberon's smite ability, we would see the same results, where both the clouds and the arrows have the fused element types, similar to if we had modded cold and toxin on the weapon like in the earliest example. This, however, leads to some really bizarre behavior. If we use Lavos' augment, Valence Formation, to infuse gas damage into the Mutalist Cernos, we now have a situation where our weapon is modded for gas and solo heat at the same time, but the clouds of the Mutalist Cernos will turn that solo heat into fused gas damage. Like before, our heat damage stays exclusive to the arrow direct hit, but we also have the ability to proc gas from the arrows now, instead of only coming from the clouds. Switching Lavos' infused damage to toxin does exactly what we'd expect, turning the solo heat on the bow into gas as well, but this time we lose that solo heat proc because we are now fusing directly to the element. To clarify, adding a secondary element to a weapon with a compatible primary element will not retroactively fuse your primary element. However, adding a compatible primary element will fuse with whatever it can immediately fuse to. If you add a primary element that is compatible with a pre-existing secondary, such as adding cold when you're already modded for blast, then you will not fuse with your other solo element, and instead your added cold will go into blast. The order of which element buff is on your weapon, and whether or not it is a natural secondary element or a fusion secondary element, is very important to keep in mind, and can get a little confusing at times. We can strategize around all these complex mechanics in a variety of ways, but I'll be showcasing the two primary strategies I like to use most before handing it over to Sci. The first way is to build around the charge shot and its cloud damage scaling. Even though we're losing out pretty big on our multi-CO and therefore our direct damage with this setup, we're mainly prioritizing saturating a large area in cloud damage and hitting as many enemies as possible to deal damage with our clouds. This doesn't mean that we don't want direct hits. In fact, we want to hit as many things as possible with the arrows, and not shoot randomly into floors or walls, since the CO scaling will only kick in if the arrow is directly attached to the target. This works particularly well with frames like Saren and Lavos, since they are able to infuse those combined elements I talked about earlier, as well as with Dante, since both his birds and his tragedy will pretty much break any DOT to ridiculous levels. With this setup, we're building for the DOT, so infusing as much toxin bonus as we can on the weapon will help make our area damage from the clouds that much more potent. This strategy is particularly bad for frames who can provide lots of serration damage and direct bonus, so for the Chroma players out there, this one isn't really for you. What is for you is a setup prioritizing shooting as many uncharged shots as quickly as possible. With this build, we forego prioritizing the dot damage in exchange for pure single target shred. We will want to get a large serration bonus for this setup, as we will have our fully multiplicative gun CO from spamming uncharged shots. This strategy is much more diverse and potent, dealing an insane amount of damage when coupled with external priming. There are many frames that perform well with this setup, but some highlights are Chroma, Limbo, Mirage, and even frames like Mag and Neja can do some pretty insane stuff with a setup similar to this, with some minor tweaks. In this setup, we do not want to use any toxin on the weapon, and our focus for maximizing DPS will shift from fire rate to reload speed, as using a primed fast hands is able to double your DPS all by itself. I want to thank Sci for giving me the opportunity to fully explain and break down this weapon. If you guys would like to see us work together in the future, let us know. Back to you, Florida Man.
Thank you for opening mine and everyone else's eyes, you absolute Giga Chad. Now, as Nev mentioned before, the gun CO on the Mutalist Cernos is multiplicative when it's uncharged and not multiplicative when it is charged. But the dot damage and the damage of the cloud in the charged mode specifically is much, much stronger in terms of other Serration type buffs. Now, for these two builds I'm going to be showing you today, I am going to be prioritizing the secondary method that Nev mentioned, which is to fire as many uncharged shots as possible to take advantage of the multiplicative CO. Now, in lower levels, this is going to be pretty incredible, I would say, and will serve us very well when it comes to how we build this thing. Now, for the first build, we are going to be utilizing the one element method of the Mutalist Cernos building, where we are going to use electricity in this one. So the direct hits of the bow will deal the physical damage types as well as electrical damage, whereas the clouds will deal corrosive damage and will also give us corrosive procs and toxin procs to boost the condition overload priming. In addition, we are also going to be using the mod Radiated Reload for the bow. That way we can get not only radiation damage, but also higher reload speed so we can reload the arrows much faster when firing the weapon. Now, when it comes to modding, we are also going to be utilizing crit chance and crit damage mods, and especially boosting that critical damage as high as possible. Because even though the crit chance is kind of low at 45% when modded this way, the crit damage multiplier is what we ultimately care about, because even though it can't proc it that much, the cloud itself can, and because it lasts for a long enough amount of time, there is a good chance that it's going to proc crits pretty decently. And in addition, if we combine things like multi-shot, we'll be able to get multiple arrows as well, meaning that we have a good chance of not only proccing crits, but proccing as many status effects as possible with the clouds. Lastly, when it comes to the arcane that we're using here, we are going to be using Primary Deadhead, but I would suggest, if you can, getting a hold of Primary Blight and testing it out, because Primary Blight will also boost the critical damage of your shots when you get Toxin procs, and since this thing force procs Toxin, it's a pretty good choice. Now, when it comes to my Limbo build, we are going to be using a base range build, much like as I have done before, but it is going to be tweaked slightly because I've been experimenting a lot more with the mod Quick Thinking to convert energy to health for survivability purposes. And in addition, I am also going to be utilizing the Nautilus here. That way we can get the Nautilus to group up the enemies a lot better, so that way we can maximize the cloud damage in terms of hitting as many enemies as possible, if you will. Now with that, on to the Mutalist Cernos Corrosive Electric build performance.
Oh shit, here we go again.
I would say the Corrosive Electric build is pretty dang good overall. Even though it's a bit slower in comparison to some other weapons, it's just a lot of fun and does perform pretty decently. But I did say there were two builds that I was going to showcase, and that is where the second one comes in, and that is building entirely around pure Toxin. You see, the Corpus enemies, even though the Corrosive Electric build, as I've shown in some gameplay that you've seen, does perform pretty decently, I found the best build for them is just building straight into Pure Toxin. Because the Corpus enemies, well, they're shielded enemies, and Toxin bypass shields, and by giving the Mutalist Cernos Toxin mods, you can boost the Toxin damage of the Toxin proc that is forced onto them by the AoE. Meaning that fighting the Corpus specifically, you're going to want to go for Pure Toxin most of the time. At least in the levels of content that you're seeing anyway. And anyway, on to the Toxin build's performance.
Hello, motherfucker.
Say with that, the Toxin build is pretty okay. Probably not the best, of course, but if you want to try it out, it's there. And with that, that's been me, Sci-Fi, and Nev. This has been a really fun video to just talk about and show off the Mutalist Cernos a little bit. I think it's a highly, highly underrated weapon that I think needs a little more viewership from people, and like getting people to just try it out and see how they feel with it. But of course, it's ultimately up to you if you want to try it or not. But anyway, that's been me, Sai, and thank you again, Nev, for being a part of this video, and I'll see you guys all next time. Have a wonderful evening.